What if I told you that Ineffa is broken? And it's only gonna get better. So here's a complete guide with everything you should know about Ineffa. Ineffa is an electro unit coming out in 5.8 which enables a new reaction called Lunar Charge, but before we discuss that, we first need to understand her kit. So with all this being said, let's get right into it. Starting off with her elemental skill, which forms a shield around her, which I'll be honest is pretty much dog shit. However, that's not the end of it. Her skill also summons a mini robot that follows the enemy by teleporting around and attacking it every 2 seconds for a maximum of 10 times. Now, the crazy thing about this robot is that it has a 100% uptime with its duration far exceeding its cooldown. And if you are wondering how does this robot even choose its target, well, it seems to be proximity based, so it will attack whichever enemy is closer to you. Do note that even though these attacks are AoE, their range isn't anything crazy. Moving on to her burst, which is just a big AoE electro attack that also summons her mini robot if it wasn't already on field. If it was, however, then its duration is refreshed. Now, so far it doesn't seem like she's anything crazy, right? In fact, she seems like a 5-star official who has a summon which gets refreshed with the ultimate. And well, you aren't exactly wrong in thinking that. However, this is where her passives come into play. Starting off with her most important passive, which transforms normal electro charge reactions into a new reaction called Lunar Charge. And when this reaction is triggered, a thundercloud appears on field that attacks the enemy every 2 seconds. But before we discuss this reaction in detail, let's first discuss the rest of her kit. So along with converting electro charge to lunar charge, she also buffs the reaction's base damage by 0.7% for every 100 points of attack she has for up to 14%, meaning 2000 attack in total. Now besides this, there is another passive of hers which we will call A1 that pushes her to be an excellent sub DPS, though with a major downside. But what exactly does this passive do, you ask? Well, you see, this passive essentially makes it so that the mini robot will do an additional attack every 2 seconds if there is a lunar charge thundercloud on the field. And this passive's damage is insane. In fact, to give you an idea of how much damage this is, let's just consider the ultimate F2B team of Sucrose, Xingqiu, Fischl and Ineffa. This team's DPS is around 77,000, out of which Ineffa contributes around 40k DPS. Now, I want you to drop your prediction in the comments. How much of this DPS do you think comes from her passive? If you thought around 50%, then congrats, you're correct. Though to be precise, it's 56%. Now, one thing I didn't tell you before is that the 40k DPS number also includes the damage done by the lunar charge reaction itself. So, if we take out both A1 and the reaction damage, which is 79%, we are left with 21% of 40k DPS. And this is the damage dealt by her skill and burst, meaning she's an absolutely useless electro unit outside of lunar charge teams because she won't be able to proc her A1 or the lunar charge reaction itself, which is 79% of her total DPS. Moving on to her final passive, this one grants Ineffa herself and the active character an EM buff after Ineffa does her ultimate. So, to summarize her entire kit, just having Ineffa in the party itself changes electro charge reaction to lunar charge reaction and increases its base damage by 14%. As for her skill, it creates a shield and summons a mini robot which follows the enemy and deals electro damage every 2 seconds. On top of that, an additional hit is dealt every 2 seconds, dealing an insane amount of damage if there is a thundercloud on the field. Moving on to her burst, which is just a big AoE electro attack that refreshes the duration of the mini robot or summons it instead. Additionally, Ineffa herself and the active unit gain 6% of Ineffa's attack as EM for 20 seconds. And if you have been enjoying this video so far, then a sub to the channel would make the mini robot happy. And if you want to support even more, scroll 2 inches down this video and click the subscribe plus button to join the channel memberships and gain exclusive perks like directly DMing me on Discord or even a Genshin account review. So now that we understand how our kit functions, let's discuss the new reaction, Lunar Charge. So, unlike other reactions which only take one unit into account while calculating damage, Lunar Charge is kinda special because it can consider all 4 units in the team to calculate damage, though that's not always the case. You see, Lunar Charge occurs every 2 seconds and takes into account the stats of all units who have applied an element to the enemy within that 2-second interval. Also, unlike Electro Charge, this reaction can crit, which is just insane. So let's understand how this reaction functions with an example. First, the game takes note of the units who have applied an element to the enemy within the 2-second interval. Next, for each individual unit, the game decides whether they will crit in the Lunar Charge reaction or not, and this chance is based on each unit's individual crit rate. So, in our example, let's assume that all 4 units applied an element to the enemy within the 2-second interval, and only Chlorand is the one that does not crit. Now, the game calculates the lunar charge damage of each unit based on these stats, and then the damage obtained is sorted in descending order. After that, the final lunar charge damage is calculated by adding the highest damage with half of the second highest damage and 1/5 of the third and fourth highest damage. Now, this value is what will be shown whenever the thundercloud strikes, provided all units applied an element and only Cloran was the one that did not crit. Now, one interesting thing to note here is that the damage number shown in-game will either have a big font size indicating crit if even one of the units participating in the reaction crits, or a small font size indicating non-crit if all units didn't crit. And if you have been listening to what I have been yapping, you would have figured out by now that you should only level up her skill and burst, as her normal attacks are absolutely useless. So, now that we understand her kit and the new reaction perfectly, let's discuss weapons. And to no one's surprise, her signature is obviously the best in slot, as its effect is literally tailor-made for her by buffing her own attack and the team's lunar charge damage whenever Ineffa makes a shield. However, if you don't want to pull this weapon, then any of the 5-star statistics like Staff of Scarlet Sand, Symphonist, Chroma, Elegy, or even Primordial would work. If you do buy the Battle Pass, then Ballad and Deathmatch are your best options, with Ballad requiring at least 3 different elemental units in the party. As for the free-to-play options, Missive Wind Spear, Dragon's Bane, or Kitane Cross Spear are your best choices. However, if you are running her in a team where Ineffa requires more ER, feel free to run her on Engulfing or Favonius or any other ER weapon to reach those energy requirements. As for the question of C1 versus weapon, the weapon is more of an upgrade for her unless you were planning on running her on Staff of Scarlet Sands. The full list of her weapon rankings is displayed on screen, but keep in mind these will vary heavily based on your team composition. Moving on to her artifacts. The best set currently is 4-piece Gilded, though I wouldn't recommend farming for it at the moment because there is obviously going to be a new set for her in 6.0. Also, if your team doesn't have a unit on Tenacity, then that's also a solid option for Ineffa to buff the team's damage. As for the stats, attack percent Sands and Goblet with crit rate or damage circular depending on your crit values to maximize her shield and EM buff. You can also use EM Sands or Goblet as an alternative, but that's around 2 to 3% worse than double attack in general. Do note that if you are running her on Staff of Scarlet Sand, then double EM is a better choice, and if it's Kitane, then EM attack is better. As for the substats, focus on getting as much crit and attack as possible with a minor focus on EM. Also, try getting to at least 140 ER in double electro teams and 180 in solo electro ones to burst every rotation. Or you can just ignore ER in solo electro comps and instead choose to burst every other rotation. Now, before we discuss teams, let's quickly discuss Constellations. Constellation 1 increases lunar charge damage by 2.5% for every 100 points of attack she has for up to 2000 attack, meaning 50% buff to lunar charge damage. Though this only comes into effect when she creates a shield, which is after using her skill. Overall, this is an 18% damage increase over C0. Constellation 2 makes it so that whenever she bursts, she will also create a shield, therefore activating Constellation 1 without using the skill. Additionally, if her burst hits a group of enemies, it will mark one of them, and when that marked opponent is attacked, or if it isn't attacked, then after a brief delay, an AoE electro hit will be done, which is considered as lunar charge damage and is essentially the same thing as her A1 passive, but has a crazy 300% attack multiplier. Overall, it's an increase of 28% over C1. C3 increases her skill level by 3 and is a 1% damage increase over C2. C4 fixes any ER issues you might have been having with her, as Ineffa recovers 5 energy every 4 seconds for every lunar charge reaction triggered by the party members. This constellation will have a varying effect based on the team composition, but on average it's an increase of 15% over C3. C5 increases her burst level by 3 and is a 1% damage increase over C4. Constellation 6 is essentially the C2 effect with a lower 135% attack multiplier, but instead of just happening once after the burst, it'll happen constantly every 3.5 seconds. Overall, it's an increase of 39% over C5. Now, I'd say that her constellation breakpoints are C1, C2 and C6, as those provide the most value of them all. And if you have been enjoying this video so far, then a sub to the channel would make you win every 50-50. And if you want to support even more, scroll 2 inches down this video and click the subscribe plus button to join the channel memberships and gain exclusive perks like directly DMing me on Discord or even a Genshin account review. So finally, let's discuss teams. And if you understood her kit, then you'd know she is meant to be played in Lunar charge teams and not as a general off-field electro unit for any team like Overload or Aggravate, cause like I said before, most of her damage comes from her A1 passive and that requires Lunar charge Thundercloud to be on field, therefore kinda restricting her to teams where Lunar charge can be triggered. Her best team at the moment is with Nuvillet and honestly is a slight upgrade over his previous best team, with the new team edging out slightly. And not to mention, Ineffa also provides a shield, which is a nice quality of life upgrade for Nuvillet to prevent stagger. You can also run her with other Hydro on-fielders like Ayato, Kokomi or Child, but these are obviously worse than Nuvillet. Another team archetype which is best suited for her is the Taser comp. Eva's team in specific receives almost a 10k DPS buff compared to his previous best team, and not to mention his kit is literally being upgraded in 5.8 to include Lunar charge in his buffs as well. Other Anemo drivers which can be used instead of Aoife are Sucrose or Mizuki, which also benefit from Ineffa due to her own high personal damage. Other units which work with Ineffa are Electro DPSs like Raiden, Voresa, Sino or Chlorant. Do note that the Raiden Ineffa team is on the same level as that of her previous best team and so isn't much of an upgrade. In fact, the whole team is being carried by Ineffa's damage. However, in Voresa's case, her previous teams are much better than the Lunar charge team cause you gotta replace Ian-san with Ineffa in the team, which results in a massive loss of damage. In case of Chlorant, both Electro and Lunar charge teams are on par with each other, but neither of those teams are her best teams to begin with, so I wouldn't recommend using her with Ineffa anyway. The only Electro DPS which benefits from Ineffa is Sino, as his Lunar charge teams are a noticeable upgrade over his previous best teams. Another archetype to run her in are Overwave teams, but based on how her kit functions, wouldn't that take away from Ineffa's personal damage? Well, you see, Ineffa's A1 requires a Thundercloud to be on field. However, once you trigger Lunar charge, the cloud will stay on field for 5 seconds, which means her A1 will be triggered. And that's why Overwave teams with Mawika, Arlecchino, Chaska or Yoimiya do work with her. Though in each one's case, their previous teams are better than the teams with Ineffa, and the only exception is Yoimiya, where the previous team is just marginally better. And finally, another archetype you can play her in are Hyper Blue alhaitham teams with double Electro or Hydro units in the team. Do note that running double Dendro in a team will result in too much Dendro application, which in turn means no Lunar charge. With all this being said, I'd say that Ineffa is a solid unit to have, as she's not just the best sub DPS in the game currently, but her damage at the moment is literally at its bare minimum, cause she will get an upgrade with the new Nordcry set plus the new craftable weapons and other Nordcry supports, which will make her totally broken. And not to mention, Hoyo purposely decided to make Ineffa a shielder and not a healer, which means she is not really meant to work with Furina and instead will probably be better with Columbina, who is of the Hydro element and rumored to be an Archon level unit. But hey,
That's just a theory. A game theory.